So welcome back to the Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought, and I am continuing onward with a special series of reviewing books and authors who have published in this big tradition, and today I have a really special guest. Professor Andrew Bowie here, who is a professor of philosophy and German at the Royal Holloway, University of London, and founder and director of the Humanities and Arts Research Center, HARC. He has worked to promote a better understanding of German philosophy in the Anglophone and analytic tradition, including the works of Johann Georg Hamann, Johann Gottfried von Herder, Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Novalis, of course, Schelling, Friedrich Schlegel, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Walter Benjamin, Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Theodor W. Adorno, Jürgen Habermas, Albrecht Velmer, and Manfred Frank. He has translated the works of Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling and Friedrich Schleiermacher, and his recent work has focused on music and philosophy, and Adorno on the nature of philosophy. In addition to his philosophical works on music, he is a keen jazz saxophonist and has played with the leading contemporary jazz musicians such as Al Casey and Humphrey Lyttelton. He is the author of Schelling and Modern European Philosophy, an Introduction, From Romanticism to Critical Theory, Schleiermacher's Hermeneutics and Criticism and Other Writings, Aesthetics and Subjectivity from Kant to Nietzsche, Introduction to German Philosophy from Kant to Habermas, Music, Philosophy, and Modernity from 2009, Philosophical Variations, Music as Philosophical Language, German Philosophy, A Very Short Introduction, which is fantastic, Adorno and the Ends of Philosophy, Aesthetic Dimensions of Modern Philosophy, Theodor W. Adorno, Very Short Introduction. Thank you so much for being here and for discussing your new text in paperback. And we're kind of celebrating its release, Aesthetic Dimensions of Modern Philosophy. And right now I'm going to describe what the book is about, and then we'll jump right into the discussion. So much of contemporary philosophy, especially in the analytic tradition, regards aesthetics as a lesser significance than epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language. Yet in aesthetic dimensions of modern philosophy, Andrew Bowie explores the idea that art and aesthetics have crucial implications for those areas of philosophy. In the modern period, the growth of warranted scientific knowledge is accompanied both by a heightened concern with epistemological skepticism and a new philosophical attention to art and the beauty of nature. This suggests that modernity involves problems concerning how human beings make sense of the world that go beyond questions of knowledge and are reflected in the arts. The relationship of art to philosophy is explored in Montaigne, Descartes, Hume, Kant, Schelling, the early German Romantics, and Hegel. The book also considers Cassier's and the Hermeneutic tradition's exploration of close links between the meaning and language and in art, and the work of Karl Polanyi, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Adorno, Dewey, and others used to investigate how the modern sciences and the development of capitalism change both humankind's relationship to nature and the nature of value, and so affect the role of art in human self-understanding. The aesthetic dimensions of modern philosophy can help to uncover often neglected historical shifts and how subjective and objective are conceived, seeing art as a kind of philosophy and a philosophy as a kind of art, and reveals unresolved tensions between the different cultural domains of the modern world and questions some of the orientation of contemporary philosophy. So once again, welcome, Professor Andrew Bowie, and thank you so much for being here on the Young Idealist today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for that very nice introduction.
One of the most interesting things about the book at the beginning, which I guess is sort of your preface and maybe your introduction, you talk about being a young man and seeing some of your favorite jazz musicians for the first time. And as you're experiencing this music, being yourself a musician, and also maybe experiencing symphonies in Berlin, you say that this experience gives you certain access to knowledge that perhaps science or even philosophy can't give. So part of the book that I found fascinating was this dislocation between subject and world, where the aesthetic sense helps us disclose our relationship to the world that sometimes the so-called mechanistic or scientific doesn't. So how did this project become a solid book?
I think the main thing was, I mean, I've been sort of pursuing what's the basis of the book for most of my academic career in some way, because I started in, my PhD was on literature, though from a very kind of philosophical perspective. It was on history and the novel. You can find it online somewhere. Um, Really, I mean, the book, in a sense, I probably ought to be more upfront about this, given this the way that things are in terms of publication, etc. It is a sort of kind of polite but fairly emphatic rejection of most of what goes on in analytical philosophy, um, because I can't see the point. I mean, it seems to come up with theories that look like sort of scientific theories, and of course they're not, because they don't predict anything, or very rarely, and they don't, have any pragmatic use in terms of, solving a lot of practical problems in the everyday world. Now, it doesn't mean to say it's all a waste of time, but it does mean that, there might be something missing. And there's something missing. I mean, I think the easiest way to look at what Dewey says about experience is that, our relationship to the world is not one of the subject confronting an object. I mean, it's we're in it, as it were, and it's a sort of active process. And that's what he means. And the point is, the active process can become very distorted and pathological. Look at the world today, because of the way we, relate to things and other people. Um, and so the experience of seeing the Ellington band live, as a young, very young and very enthusiastic, lover of jazz, I just kind of discovered it 2 or 3 years before. I sort of thought, I'm now 73, I'm getting old. Um, what has, influenced more what I do in terms of how I think about, what's good in the world, and how, how we value things in the world, and how things make sense above all. That's what the book's really about. Um, and I thought, listening to 3 minutes of Johnny Hodges playing the alto solo on, blues called Things Ain't What They Used to Be, that has never gone away. I mean, I fortunately found a recording online. It's on. You can get the record online, as it were, from a previous same tour but different concert, and it's just still there. And you think, well, it must matter a lot, even though one tends to dismiss it. I used to think, oh, I'll get bored with jazz and music, but you're kidding. It's gone the opposite way around. I've got far more interested and still am getting more interested. So it's looking at something, a key experience like that, and then hearing Carrie Ann conduct Bruckner's Eighth, my favorite symphony. And Bruckner's Eighth has this wonderful, wonderful conclusion, which is my favorite 3 minutes of music, where it moves from C minor to C major, as described scientifically or, theoretically. But when it's done right, it's absolutely overwhelming. I mean, it just gets me every time in a good performance. And it's the kind of fulfillment that you don't get much in everyday life, and yet we need that sort of thing, and that sort of approach to transcendence, if you want. You get in something like that, which you can be as atheistic as I am, and still think this is a moment. This is of such value. I've listened to that hundreds of times, and I've got 30 odd versions. Um, the philosopher Michael Tanner, who worked in a similar area to me in Cambridge, I mean, he had 75 apparently, as a reveal when he died. But that sort of experience, it doesn't go away. That was when I was in my 20s somehow, and I still listen to that. I have to restrict how often I listen to the symphony because you've got to do new things. So the basis of the book is really came from sort of trying to commensurate one's life experience with what one thinks philosophically, which one tends to do gradually as you get older. You think, well, how much does this matter? And the whole premise of and what I think is wrong with analytical philosophy is it doesn't explain why things matter. It tries to explain how we know things, or what it would be right to do, or what's a good life, and doesn't succeed. I mean, in terms of the sort of aims you'd assume would be true of theoretical work. I mean, it succeeds to the extent it makes you reflect on these things, but it doesn't do what's on the tin. Whereas music kind of does do that. I mean, I think Adorno's wrong when he says it's just appearance. It's not. It's far too real for that. I mean, it changed my life, both those experiences, and musical experiences still do. So that's what was behind this. I mean, this commensuration of the personal experience with, well, what do you think theoretically, combined with, and this has become ever more emphatic, the state of a world which is heading down the tubes. I mean, we really are in deep, deep trouble. And that clearly has to do with how humankind relates to nature. And that's what aesthetics, aesthetics emerged at much the same time as people started to think there may be something wrong, like Schelling in particular, with how we see nature. We objectify it in ways which can become a big problem.
The first chapter is on grounding the subject. Now, someone that reads 18th and 19th century philosophy and that sadly have not read Montaigne, I was surprised to see the book starting off with Montaigne. But the interesting thing about Montaigne that you bring up here is that he's not concerned with, questioning the primacy afforded to knowledge based on arguments, but he's more concerned with how the essay or the structure of the essay, as inconsistent as it is, as you state, is not searching for coherence, but articulating a complex movement of vision.
I mean, I hadn't read Montaigne until I decided to write the book, and I was sort of persuaded by a PhD student of mine which has come out as a book on philosophy and the essay. So I had to actually trail my way through a lot of text, which wasn't a chore at all. Um, and it's this sense of Montaigne is quite often mentioned by Friedrich Schlegel. I mean, Schlegel I think got a lot from Montaigne. It's not, I don't think anyone's written much about that, but the essayistic thing is there in Schlegel, and the whole fragment thing is kind of like some of what you get in Montaigne. That instead of trying to come up with a complete coherent system, you illuminate things and see how they connect, often at random. So it's a kind of improvisatory side to it, which appeals to the jazz musician in me. The bottom line of it is then that somehow the form of the essay, with an S at the end, is as important as the content. I mean, some of it's obviously kind of out of date and historically interesting, but not so philosophically interesting. But the way it persuades you into positions and then suggests, but um, appeals, and it's a kind of aesthetic appeal because it's done through the form of moving on, and that's what's missing from so much philosophy is this sense of how do you respond to the fact that life is mobile. Um, that's why music, and so I think it's so important, philosophically, because music moves on. You can't stop it because it ceases to be, as it were, and so does life, as it were. And yet, so much philosophy seems to be devoted to how can we freeze the picture into metaphysics of the ready-made world, basically, to use Putnam's phrase. And that seems to me, it's clearly a mistake. It doesn't work. So how do you come to terms with that? And it's not in a sort of Hegelian way of, we arrive at something final through contradiction. It's, no, we don't arrive at it. It's an endless journey. And Montaigne kind of embodies that really successfully, I think, that, he doesn't end up anywhere final, apart from the grave, as it were, which she's clear about. It's quite disturbing some of the time, given how easy dying was in those days. So yeah, basically, then the sense that the form of philosophy can be as important as the notional content. The two can't be separated anyway.
Another thing that's really interesting at the beginning of the book, again from the introduction, you talk about, I think, a jazz musician playing something so-called wrong. Let me put this scare quote, sorry. Um, but there's no real way of playing wrong because playing wrong can also be playing something right. Um,
Well, that's the bottom line of the book in a way. I mean, it's the Thelonious Monk said that somebody said, "Oh, that was wrong," and he said, he simply in classic Monk style. Monk, by the way, is appearing over my shoulder here. There's an original photograph that a friend of mine gave me from a concert she was at. Monk says, wrong's right. Now, okay, you can exaggerate this. I mean, it's every jazz musician is terrified of playing wrong, but the progress of jazz is to figure out how to make notes that were wrong then sound right. Um, and that seems to be a perfect metaphor for what I'm thinking, philosophically, and how one should think about the world in the way that, you can incorporate stuff, and that stuff that was wrong then becomes right, then can become boring, can become, cheesy, to use this sort of classic sort of jazz musicians thing. Um, and so then you're forced on, and as a player, that's what you do. I mean, you're constantly looking for ways of not playing the same thing, and ways of playing things that don't sound boring. And very often when you're improvising, I mean, it is a good idea to deliberately play a wrong note, um, and see how you resolve it. If you practice a lot, you've got to play a hell of a lot to be able to do this so that it works. It doesn't always work for me. It quite often does these days. So it's that sort of that's a kind of metaphor for the whole book. I mean, that the history of modern art, in a way, is a history of making what was taken to be wrong as into what's right. And of course, you can apply that across the moral sphere. Think in terms of issues on gender and homosexuality, etc. That progress, it tends to be things which were condemned as wrong suddenly start to make sense if you look at them in a certain way, and you realize there's nothing wrong with this. This actually can, we're in Pride Week. This can actually enrich the world rather than impoverish it, and that's what one's trying to do, especially at a time where culture wars are desperately dangerous in the way in which you find something that you're trying to make out to be wrong, and this creates division and ultimately leads to violence. Um, and the history of jazz is really good for this. It's the same thing in a way happens in classical music, but it's because it's so short, the history of jazz, it enables you to sort of to realize that wrong's right is a really profound thing to say, by a profound musician who did all sorts of things that were wrong. I mean, if you look at Monk's own chords for the tunes he plays, it's almost unplayable. And they're dead simple. They just look completely wrong. It's very interesting. Whereas everyone cleans them up a bit. So it's that sort of sense of transgression that makes new sense that one's looking at, which is the history of modern art in a way. Yeah.
So, what is the role of reflection in relation to the aesthetic?
I think the point about the reflection on the subject is that it doesn't end up in a satisfactory position. I mean, I think I am. Everyone from Schelling to God knows who, Heidegger, etc., all say this doesn't really work, does it? Because it doesn't explain what that means. Basically, is thinking, being, and so on. So reflection doesn't really give an adequate account of the subject. So what you look at is, well, so given that in some way the subject is groundless, Schleiermacher is very good on some of this. The feeling of absolute dependence, that we aren't grounded in that way. So it is, you're forced into a constant reflection on, well, what could make sense of this, and how can I establish a place in the world that makes sense for me, and not just for me, of course, but for others. And one of the routes to this, I mean, one shouldn't overdo it, but I mean, is aesthetic activity. Um, you can overdo the sense of this is the center of everything and so on. But I think it's because it's been so neglected outside in philosophy. I mean, it should one has to overemphasize it. That so and the key line is the one I was quote from Novalis about the absolute that's given to us is it arises through our failure to achieve it. Now you think, oh, so give up then? No, the point is it doesn't go away. I mean, and the simple way to understand that, and again, using the basic story of me, is well, if you start playing an instrument, especially in jazz. I mean, it works in classical music, but I think in jazz it's probably more emphatic. You can never be good enough. You can never get to the point where you've done it all, and yet you still want to get it right. And that seems to me a much better attitude towards, life in general. That, you aspire to higher things. I mean, something that transcends the mundane, the boredom, the aggression, etc., which is social. And to do this in a way that works, it involves realizing that you're faced with a constant failure, but it's a meaningful failure because it takes you further on. Um, and it doesn't stop. I mean, it stops when you finish, as it were, in absolute terms as well as in relative terms. Um, and it just seems to me, especially at a time when the humanities are in huge crisis and we're in a world which looks for technological solutions for everything, that we're losing sight of just how important all that is. I mean, most of my best social relationships and friendships and so on have come through playing. Jazz musicians in particular tend to be really interesting, nice people because they've got something that they're focusing on, which can only be done better. Um, and if you take it seriously, then you've got an endless task, but it's not an endless task that's futile. And that seems to me that's a pretty good way of looking at things, as it were.
Do you see Kant's aesthetics in this sense? And I mean in terms of both teleology and the kind of reflective sense, and even in regards to the sublime. Do you see this as a positive element in regards to judgment?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about the teleology stuff. I mean, there's more to be said about that, and I think there are ways of defending some of it. But I think some of the key things he does in the third critique um, still are really, worth of value. That because he's looking for ways, he's looking for ways out of problems in his own, philosophy, which is essentially, cognitive and ethical, and realizing that, there's something missing. Um, and as I've been saying, I mean, one of the state of the modern world, it tends to be that the cognitive has taken over in the sense of technology, etc. The ethical, I've just been reading McIntyre. I mean, it really is true that there is no way of simply founding a new ethics and so on. So the ethical is bound to be endlessly conflictual. And in some way, the aesthetic would be as well, but and the point of Kant that seems to me to work is that he's also insisting that you can have effectively true judgments about art, even though they're subjective. Which then means an appeal to your other to the person you're engaging with, where you can't give them definitive proof. Cavell talks about this really effectively. I mean, he said simply you've got to say, look, now listen to this bit, and the only way to do it, is to actually experience that thing. And it may be it doesn't work initially. But one of the great things about music, modern music, is one expands one's domain because things you don't initially like, nobody initially likes Bruckner, sort of thing, then it becomes a total obsession. Um, and and then then you can argue why against people who say Bruckner's boring, endless repetition. Well, no, actually. And you're in the space of reasons, and that's what Kant's talking about. The sociality is part of what of the aesthetic. I mean, you have to justify your judgments to be of beauty, to be true to everybody, to be acceptable. Let's put it that way, rather than you'd have to use true. 'Cause that raises too many problems. So that sort of aim for some sort of universality seems to me, that's really valuable. I mean, it's never attainable in that sense, but it is interesting that I mean that the music of that period has a kind of achieved a sort of universality. I mean, it's all over the world. I mean, it's probably in these days most successfully, increasingly being played in the Far East. The number of great musicians coming out of the Far East. So there's something about that tradition, and I really don't go for some sort of relativistic view that well, it's only subjective, blah blah. You might not like it, but you could still at the same time say, well, it's still great music. There's two dimensions in that sort of response to things. And if you think this actually is really important, I forced myself to sit down and listen to Schoenberg because I couldn't get it. It didn't bother me in that sense. I didn't. And then it's slowly, you suddenly realize, oh yeah, I see this sort of now. Like, as I get older, I'm less interested in that. I listen more and more to just the great tradition, as it were. Um, so what Kant's doing, is framing it in a really good way. I mean, it's getting out of, and that's one of the points of the book, that aesthetic judgments are not just subjective. They are subjective in a way that scientific judgments aren't, but they're making an appeal to something beyond the subject, I to a sensus communis, some sense of what binds us together as human beings. And again, we need more of that. And the way that governments are cutting arts budgets, etc. Okay, but but a lot of which goes on things just for privileged people. But they're also cutting budgets for music in school. They've wrecked music in schools in this country, for instance. And yet, the great places I find sociality that works, is doing gigs and going to hear people play. That's one example. There's plenty of other ways you can do it, but that's just my sort of take. But it does exemplify what Kant's on about. That common sense in the sense of what can we share that isn't just cognitive and isn't just moral.
I was wondering if you could go over um, this idea of the pseudo proposition and romantic negation in Novalis, since I have you here, if that's all right.
It starts with Leibniz in the sense that there is no real identity. Um, the only thing that's identical is something identical with itself. So all identity, at some sense, is therefore synthetic. So even A equals A, the first A and the second A are not the same A. So what does identity mean? And that's why it's a pseudo proposition, because it's not saying it is X. It's saying, well, this is how we express it. But that then is, in a way, is just the same sort of thing goes on. So how does art express the absolute? Well, listen. Here's an expression of an attempt, Bruckner's eighth conclusion, to sort of to get somewhere that we normally can't go, or which we ultimately can't get to anyway, but which draws us on. End of Mahler's eighth, using Goethe's Faust, the eternal woman, he draws us on, and that's how meaning in life works. It motivates you to want to do something, to and it isn't that you then arrive having, oh, I've done this and I've done exactly what I wanted to do. It's never like that. So identity in that sense, I think that's what Novalis is getting at. It doesn't happen. It's something we strive for. It's how would we be? His line on philosophy is being at home in the world, seeking to be at home in the world. We're never fully at home in the world. It's always partial. There's always something lacking. But without that lack, nothing makes any sense because you lose all motivation. You get the same idea in your favorite text. I mean, in the Freiheitsschrift, I mean, in Schelling, that's precisely what that's all about. But yeah, so roughly that in relation to Novalis. That's why I think Novalis is fantastic. His thing about pseudo proposition, all that text is itself aesthetic. It's not a statement of a theory. It's a reflection on something. And if we look at it like this, does this help? And the answer, in my view, is yes, it does. That's why I think the German Romantics were so important. Fortunately, they're getting their due now, but I mean, it took forever because they were too weird, I suppose. But one of the good things about the world, in the progressive area, is that things that were weird are now becoming more acceptable as long as they're not damaging to people. Look at it and see what happens. Which again is what happens in the history of jazz. When Ornette Coleman starts playing, even Miles Davis can't figure it, but Ornette wins. He does something that nobody's done before, and he's now a major figure that changes how you hear things.
And I guess so one of the underlying conclusions of the book is how truth can be grounded philosophically through literary works with aesthetics, philosophy, music, art.
The basic thing is it's either Hegel, in which case you resolve negation into the absolute, or it's the early romantics, in which case you say no, negation is how we access the world because we're constantly drawn on by something which is negative, which you're trying to overcome. But there's no final account of that because that's cutting off possibilities. We can't. You're trying to transcend contingency, and you can't. I mean, there were ways of reading Hegel that make it less of a problem. But I do note, I mean, the person who's written this huge encomium of praise for the book, Robert Pippin, has now started to agree with me on this, that he's left Hegel and said, basically Heidegger, who's another version of this, is probably right about this, that, the absolute, etc.
With Hegel, we see the nature of truth being and converging with art and representing unity as raising humanity above nature. So do you see Hegel's response to aesthetics or Hegel's understanding of art? Do you see that negatively in an approach to aesthetics, or do you see Hegel in this same line of figures that you have picked out from Montaigne to Kant to Schelling to many of the other thinkers as well too?
It's interesting. I mean, part of the point of the Hegel bit is to say that, why did he keep coming back to aesthetics, as he in his later life, given that he'd put it in a sort of subordinate position in the system. And it's in a subordinate position in the system because it's dependent on particularity, like sensuousness, etc. And the whole point of philosophy is to transcend the sensuous, which is always contradictory, into pure thought. The question is, what does that mean? And the sort of the anti-metaphysical readings is saying, it's just that there's nothing that it escapes that is unthinkable in some sense. I mean, even to say it's unthinkable is a thought. Um, you know, and it seems to me that there's his continuing engagement with art and aesthetics kind of suggests that he realizes there's something slightly missing, which is there in precisely in Schlegel and Novalis. He didn't get on with Schlegel, and I think he misinterprets Schlegel for being, this is all not serious. That Schlegel's irony is, it's the irony of the subject that just floats above things, doesn't get involved in the real world. And he says it's derived from Fichte, the subject positing it's and so on, where he's saying the subject is also constituted by the world it lives in, which is fair enough. I mean, absolutely, no disagreement. And the question is, well, how far do what direction do you then look for the transcendence that's involved in philosophy? And he thinks, well, because it's tied to the sensuous, art doesn't ultimately do it. But then you read what he says about, say, the novel, which is the highest form of art for Hegel is comedy, of course, if you look at the system. But the novel is, what he says about it is really interesting. It can take anything into itself. There's no limit on what the novel can assimilate. Um, and then you start thinking, yeah, this is going in the direction I want, as it were. That the novel, can show things that will not be shown by reading a philosophical text. He doesn't say that, but you can start to infer that. The novel is the form, Lukács's notion of transcendental homelessness. It's when you realize that you can't ground anything, that you set off on the endless journey. And Hegel kind of doesn't want that ultimately. And that's one of the reasons he doesn't get music, though he says some very interesting things about music. So what I tried to do in that chapter was to suggest, there's a sort of a sign of what might be wrong in Hegelianism through his fact that he kept coming back to art, which he, supposedly has finished as the most important way of confronting the modern world. But it clearly hasn't. I mean, there are huge problems about art these days. There's huge problems, say, in music. But it's clearly, still a central way in which we try to come to terms with the world.
You state this claim, and I think the first maybe 4 or 5 pages, you say language both creates and liberates the spaces for art. What did you mean by that?
It's a way of stating, Charles Taylor's contrast between what he calls designative, i.e., analytical, but in the tradition of Locke, etc., views of language, and what he calls constitutive views of language. So it's a way of saying, language itself is inherently, always potentially aesthetic because it can disclose things in new ways. And without it, we can't even get started. And so, the world we live in is constituted by the language we use. And so the transformation of the language we use is going to transform the world we live in. So it's a way of talking about that. I mean, I think Taylor's distinction is dead right. That the constitutive view is the one that is about, again, how we make things matter, as opposed to how we identify things. Because why, you don't always want to be identifying things. You might be wanting to, eat them, play with them, etc., hate them. Our responses to the world are not just, cognitive. And you read enough analytical philosophy and of a certain kind, and you start thinking, well, this isn't the world I actually inhabit. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's that view, and part of the point of that chapter is to join the fortunate renaissance of Cassirer, because philosophy of symbolic forms is one of the great books of 20th century philosophy. It's easily as good and important as Being and Time. It's a bit long-winded, but it's absolutely fascinating. Habermas realized this. He got very into Cassirer quite some time ago now. He also finally got into Schleiermacher. The one time I had dinner with him, he said, I finally got Schleiermacher. So, who's again in that tradition. I mean, Schleiermacher says a lot of the things that Cassirer then cashes out in much more, well, in more contemporary terms as well. I mean, that, we have to look at the world as constituted through symbolic forms, which, are constantly shifting. And he's great on the sense that, even what we mean by objectivity is not something objective. It's something that's historically, changes. So what we regard as objective, it depends where we are in history. And it's things like that, and that again feels like an aesthetic point. I mean, that, your view of what's objective is what stands against you, to use the German word, and how that thing stand against you changes. If you have more technology, lots of things fall away as problems, but then other things become problems. Like, the most worrying thing about doing this was not me talking, being unable to answer. It was that Zoom was going to crash or my computer, all that, as it were, that the Gegenstand, the object, was going to, betray me. Which is a musician's thing. I always take two saxophones to every gig, even if I'm not going to play one of them, because the fear of it not playing is the worst thing you can imagine. And it's quite easy. I mean, saxophones are rather sensitive beasts, as it were. Cassirer does really well is to suggest that, language and art are in some sense continuous with each other. That, as opposed to an objectifying view of language, he's saying, it does the same sort of thing as art does. And he says there's some great formulations, which I try and quote in the book on that issue. And again, that changes how you'd respond. How people doing analytical philosophy tend not to think of any of that, which seems to me, impoverishing. I've nothing against, formal semantics, etc. You can learn from it. But what I have, my objection, which I try to do fairly politely, is to the exclusion of things from philosophy, which are clearly philosophically vital, i.e., the constitutive way in which language actually works in the world. It does things. It took till Austin to get the notion of a speech act into language as action. What does that tell you?
Because you use one of the analytic philosophers that I absolutely love, Davidson. And I think Davidson has a great way of writing. He'll talk about the smell of the coffee that he, in the morning before before hearing his partner come down the steps or something like that. So he's got a very descriptive way of writing that I think that kind of goes beyond just average analytic
Oh
philosophy.
yeah, no, sure. I mean, Davidson's a hero of mine. I mean, especially when he talks about metaphor and so on. I mean, he's clearly saying that a certain kind of analytical project is doomed to failure, because he's a pragmatist, and so am I. Um,
Now, you do bring up mythology to a certain extent, and you bring up one of my favorite quotes by Schelling, Lectures on the Philosophy of Art, where he says that language is faded mythology. Do you think that there is something aesthetic about mythology?
in retrospect, mythology becomes aesthetic, in the sense of it gives you a kind of symbolic form, how the world was understood, which then is overcome by disenchantment, etc. And the big issue really is, are we trying to re-enchant the world through art, which I think is a mistake, as opposed to saying, no, well, no, what we're trying to do through art is to keep the world open to new possibilities and to improvement, as it were. But so, yeah, mythology is clearly, why is Greek tragedy based on mythology, as it were? I mean, it's a way of making sense of the world in symbolic terms, which is takes you, the next step is through art. I mean, Hegel deals with that very well, actually, in Aesthetics.
Towards the end, you bring up The Birth of Tragedy, which, believe it or not, is my favorite work by Nietzsche. And in that text, you have the Cora, you have the Apollonian, the Dionysian, but then something happens with Socrates, with Plato, the dialectic, and he sees the end of tragedy with this dialectic. Now, do you see in the Nietzschean terms the dialectic related to what we would call mechanism? Do you see that kind of relationship, or what do you think? Do you agree with Nietzsche's take on this in this text?
The dialectic, if it equals Hegel, then okay, yeah, we can go along with there's something missing here, which is got through other symbolic ways of responding to the world. Um, I mean, both tragedies are kind of a weird mix. I mean, it's based on bits of Schelling, as far as I can see. I mean, the Apollo Dionysus thing is there in Schlegel and Schelling. I seem to remember, I've written about it somewhere. Key to it is to understand how he then links that to Wagner as a revival of mythology, because I think that then starts to get dodgy. I mean, that drifts us towards Nuremberg rally style stuff. That we don't want to revive it, but but why then? Because I'm a massive Wagner fan, though I never have time to listen to Wagner, even though I'm retired. But I have on occasion bathed in it, and I've seen The Ring 2 or 3 times in Berlin. Um, so how you would deal with that, because that's where the crux comes. So what does this mean for the contemporary capitalist world, as it were, which is lurking in what Nietzsche's saying? And Wagner does see this. I mean, I think I talk about that in the book. I mean, that he, as Bernard Shaw does, links Wagner to Marx, to what's going wrong in capitalism and so on. And the question is, so what's the way out of that? And that's, in some senses, that's what we're still looking for. Capitalism in its present form cannot survive, and if it does, then the world won't survive. So, Nietzsche gets something there, but I'm not sure if the way he does it it makes me feel very comfortable. Let's put it that way, which is probably what he wants, as it were. But yeah, I think Wagner is very important in all that because so much of film and so on is massively, far more than people realize, influenced by Wagner. Any film with music that's at all dramatic is Wagner. It wouldn't be like that but for Wagner. And we clearly, people need something like that. I mean, why do people love, films with great music or, why is that always there in film? And that seems to be really important. I've not written or thought that much about that, actually. I must think more about it. Greek tragedy and what it meant and what it did is vital in the sense that, it clearly did, found in some ways a community. It is a way of making sense without conjuring away of the fact that life can be appalling. And the very nature of human existence is that you're going to be faced with contradictions which have no resolution. Um, and we need a better sense of that. But one's got to be very careful with that because the modern world does give you lots of ways of avoiding tragedy and yet still creates it, and God knows we know at the moment. And how does the mindset, what sort of mindset would it be that incorporated the tragic into life without pretending to conjure away things we could actually solve? Because I'm not an opponent of great technology. The problem is technology plus capitalism.
Well, I have to thank you so much for being here and taking us through major themes of your text. For anyone that is familiar with Professor Bowie's work, this is a fantastic text. I recommend anything by Professor Bowie. But yes, Aesthetic Dimensions of Modern Philosophy is now available in paperback. It's affordable. It's a fantastic text. I want to thank you so much for being here and participating in this series.
Thank you. No, I mean, I'm the book came out at the wrong time. It came out in the middle of COVID, effectively, and it was hardback and so on. So it kind of disappeared. So I'm trying to relaunch it. So I think it's probably worth reading. I hope it is. But yeah, and you doing something like this is of immense value, and I'm really grateful. And it's really nice to even at a Zoom distance to finally meet you, as it were. Thank you.